Shalom, shalom, everybody. In the name of Yahushua, HaMashiach, all praises go to our Father in heaven. So I want to come on this channel and continue our series on the Ancient Israelites were people of color, part 3, proof they were people of color. So in part 1, we talked about the Middle East, the so-called Middle East, the people living in those regions, how the different movements and the different people coming to those regions in past time. And we're trying to take you back to history and show you how, you know what? The region was different. The people looked different. This is a historical fact. Okay, so we talked about that in part 1. In part 2, we talked about, we wanted to really emphasize that the Hebrews, the Israelites, are a race of people. The scripture says it. And they, as it is this day, they are still a race. They are an ethnic group of people. And we want to show you scriptures to prove that. And so in part 3, that seed of people, that ethnic group of people looked a certain way. And so in this video, we're going to show you how the ancient Israelites, but not just the ancient Israelites, the people living in that region were people of color. And we're going to show you proof and some history to prove these things. So once again, all praises go to our Father in heaven. In the name of his precious son, Yahushua HaMashiach. So let's continue this lesson. Let's continue this Bible history. This is the Bible history series. We go over a lot of topics on this channel. We talk about a lot of different things in the spirit of Elohim by his grace. But we also want to focus on some Bible history because Bible history is a part of the scriptures. And we have to know it to understand exactly what is going on and how to see things clearly. So we pray this information will be helpful for you in your understanding. And so some of the history books that's going to be covered in this topic, we're going to use the works of Josephus. He was a Hebrew historian born in 37 AD. The whole purpose of his book, and I would definitely recommend anyone reading this book because it's a very good history record. It's not a scripture. It doesn't replace scripture, but if you want to understand a little bit about the history of the Hebrews and the people living in those regions at that time, this Israelite that wrote this gave some good information. So we're going to reference some quotes from his book. We're also going to go into Cornelius Tacitus. Okay, he was a Roman historian who did not know who the true and living Elohim was. However, he did have good information on history, and he did a little history about the Hebrews and who he thought they were. And so we're going to get some quotes from him as well. We're going to show you how the ancients, how they viewed this subject, how they viewed these people, how they described how these people in this region looked. Okay, because you got to understand in past time, we wasn't dealing with, any type of, forms of white supremacy on history. So everyone accepted how everyone was accepted. That's more of a modern day thing. We're also going to go to Herodotus. He was a Greek historian, 484 BC. We're going to see what he thought about the region of Egypt and Ethiopia and what he viewed when he did his history studies in that region. We're going to go to Godfrey Higgins, and his book is titled Nicopolis, something of that nature, maybe not said correct, but he has a history and he studied a little bit about the so-called Middle East, that region, and how he described these people at that time. We're going to go into British anthropologist Alfred Haddon, and he goes into history as well about his studies of the so-called Middle East. We're going to go to some Egyptian paintings because, a lot of those nations that were not the Hebrews, they painted themselves. A lot of pagan nations in general have this thing where they paint themselves. And so we're going to use those pictures to bring some history about this subject as well. Not the pagan part, but the part of them painting themselves and how they looked in that region. We're going to go into some old maps as well, too, to talk about a few things based on that. And then we're going to go into some scriptures as well to connect some things based on the topic. So this is a Bible history subject. It's so much more history, but I don't want to overwhelm you or give you so much information. But I pray the information we cover can be helpful to your understanding so you can get a clearer picture about Bible history from a Bible history standpoint and not be influenced by anything that's contrary to Bible history. We want to keep Bible history the way it's written, okay? And based on what historians spoke on these subjects. So once again, these are some of the history topics that we are going to be covering. And so the first thing I want to go to when we start, I want to show you 3 different maps. Now, we briefly touched on this in the first video. But I want to touch on this one more time because I want to really emphasize something to the people that's watching the video. So, as we all know, we read the Holy Scriptures and we see that you look at the map, Abram, aka Abraham, he journeyed from a certain region near Mesopotamia, also Ur of Chaldea. So we know he traveled from these regions and he moved and crossed over and came to the land of Canaan. Yah gave him a promise. So this is a map, kind of a map of the region he traveled. Now this is a map, people. Let's do the math. 1700 BC, around that time frame. So from the time of Abraham to the time Yahushua walked on the scene, it's about 1700 years. And so from the time of Yahushua, the Messiah, to now, it's about 1990 years, something around that. So if you do the math between 1990 years from Messiah to now, and from Abraham to Messiah, 1700 years, that is going to give you roughly about 3,500 years in history. So you have to understand where we're coming from when we deal with this topic so you can better understand the subject. We're showing you how this region 3,000 plus years ago that you see today, which is the same region, there were different people in this region. The region that Abraham came from, the region of Israel, the region of Egypt. This whole region was totally different. And it's very easy to understand because if you look at maps in countries today, you go to Australia, it looked totally different 500 years ago. You go to parts of America, it looked totally different. So we got to use that understanding. Yah's allowed us to see it that way. I think the only reason why people don't use that understanding because they get a little more insecure when you start getting to these holy sites in these holy areas because they believed a certain way and they pushed a certain agenda to the masses. But just take your non-biases off. Go back and take a trip into history and you'll see it's very clear the people that lived in this region and how they looked. This is a map of ancient Egypt during the time Moses came out of Egypt. So as you can see, the travels from the children of Israel going down south into Arabia, going back up north till they made it to the land of Canaan, right? AKA the land of Israel. And so this is a map from what, 1400 something BC. So from 1400 BC to Messiah, 1400 years. From Messiah to now, what, 1900 years. So this map is about what, 3,300 years old for the most part. So you see that once again, you got to understand we're looking at these maps from ancient times, and the people that lived in these regions, right? And so I want to share this map to show you this is how the region, this is how they viewed the maps in the region at this time. It's totally different than now. And it's different people that live in these regions. We'll show you shortly, okay? And the same thing goes when the children of Israel came into Egypt, around like the 1400s BC. You see the land was separated by tribes, and the tribes went to their specific colonies and they grew and developed in these specific regions they were in the land of Israel, okay? So this whole region that I'm about to cover today briefly is the so-called Middle East and how historians viewed this area, okay? So keep this in mind. So I want to show these maps to prove what we're talking about today. We're going into the ancient people at this time. Understand what we're doing, sons and daughters of Elohim. And having said those things, the first history that I want to go over is from an individual from the Grecians, 400 plus BC, by the name of Herodotus, the histories. Now, you can find all this information online, or you can purchase these books and you will be able to find these exact quotes, okay? So I want you to make sure you look these things up so you know we're not just making up scriptures or making up history. So I want to read something. When he traveled to these regions we call the so-called Middle East, this is what he saw. Let's read it. For the fact is, as soon came to realize myself, then heard from others later that the Koshans are obviously Egyptian. When a notion occurred to me, I asked both the Koshans and the Egyptians about it and found that the Koshans had better recall of some Egyptians than the Egyptians did of them. Some Egyptians said that they thought that the Koshans originated from Sesostris' army, but I myself guessed their Egyptian origin not because the Koshans are dark-skinned and woolly haired, which does not account for much by itself because these features are common in others too. But more importantly, because the Koshans, Egyptians, Ethiopians, are the only people in the world who practice circumcision, who have always done so. So this Grecian is in these regions, and we know that the Grecians and Egyptians had a relationship about 2,000 years ago when the Grecians took over that region, the whole Greek Empire, different subject. So before that, he's doing a history subject. He's writing things down, and he's noticing how these people are looking. And he's saying the Egyptians, the Colossians, and also the Ethiopians were what? He said they were Egyptian in origin. They had dark skin, woolly hair. This is what he viewed. And you may even see some translations may say curly hair. It doesn't matter. The point we're trying to show you is these people in this region, according to Herodotus, that living in that time, at that region in ancient time, were people of color. This is what he noticed. And you got to understand, white supremacy history was not big back then because no one cared about that. White supremacy history started 400, 500 years ago, during a Renaissance period, and doing those when those scientific and those philosophers theorize race based on a Caucasian perspective to uplift themselves over the rest of the world. And they conquered the world that way. But we're not coming in that spirit. We're just reading what this brother said. And he said the Egyptians were woolly haired and dark skinned. And it's a reason why we're bringing that up, because we all know the Egyptians did one thing for themselves, and a lot of these ancient cultures did it. They painted themselves. These are paintings from ancient Egypt. We're not talking about modern day Egypt. We're talking about ancient Egypt during that time. Children of Israel came out of Egypt during the time the children of Israel in the land. That's considered ancient Egypt before the Greeks came into the picture. So these are some of their paintings. As you can see, they're painting pictures of themselves. And they're also painting pictures of those who they are oppressing, whoever those nations are at that time. We know the Hebrews is one of those nations, but they were not the only nations. So these are some of their paintings of the Egyptians. They drew on their walls. They even got their little false images, their deities and all those things. But we're not referencing those things because that does not matter to us. We serve the true and living Elohim. But we're trying to show you that the same thing Herodotus said about the Egyptians in that region, these are the things they painted of themselves. And you're going to see this connection between Egypt and the Hebrews in a second. It's very important. And you can't get around this history because all throughout history, the children of Israel from a time of antiquity were always confused with the Hebrews. Were always confused, with the Egyptians. The Hebrews were always being confused with the Egyptians. So these are paintings of the Egyptians. You see a person going to visit the part of Egypt and he's looking on the walls and he's looking at the paintings of what they drew of themselves. So it's very simple. What Herodotus said about the Egyptians seems pretty correct. The ancient Egyptians were what? Dark-skinned, woolly-haired, or you can say curly-haired people. So it's clear we see this in history. But that's continued because now we have more history from Godfrey Higgins in the 17th century. He did a history and wrote a book, The Origins of Languages, Nations, and Religions, Godfrey Higgins. So based on his perspective and based on his studies of the so-called Middle East, this was one of his conclusions. And you can buy his book and you can find the very same quote. He says this: I admit with great difficulty the theory of all the early astronomical knowledge of the Chaldees have been acquired or invented by his race, and that the Chaldeans were originally Negroes. And so I didn't say it. The person that's doing a non-biased history on that region and looking at the ancient times clearly sees that the Chaldees were originally Negroes, the region that Abraham came from when he traveled from Mesopotamia to what? The land of Israel. What? From Israel to Egypt. That region. He's saying those Chaldees were originally Negroes in that ancient period. Let's continue. British anthropologist Alfred Haddon had a quote from his book, the history of anthropology, and you can look these things up as well. He says the Elamites of Mesopotamia seem to be a Negro people with kinky hair and have transmitted their racial type to the Jews and the Assyrians. So we see that the Elamites in Mesopotamia seem to be Negro. Okay, so that region so far, you see Mesopotamia, you got Egypt, you got what? You got Chaldea. So far, these historians are clearly doing their research and have this non-biased view because they're looking at past time and they see that, you know what? These people are Negroes, okay? These people are people of color, as the title of this lesson is. And to really double down and show you how historians viewed this region, we're going to go now to the works of Josephus against Apollyon, okay? And so in the book of Josephus, there's several books. At the end, There are two books called the Book of Apion, because Apion was a person that was coming against the history of our people and where we came from. Okay. He had a thing where he kept saying we were Egyptian, and we will read that shortly. But in this specific book, Josephus is quoting from another historian who is doing what? He's speaking about the nation of the Hebrews. And based on what he is seeing, he is describing their features. His name is Charalis. So Josephus is quoting from Charalis. You can find this in the book of Josephus. There's no adding or take away from it. And we're going to read exactly what Charalis, what he saw, how he viewed the Hebrew nation, the people in that region. Let's read it. Herodotus, also still an ancient writer and a poet, makes mention of our nation and informs us that it came to assistance of King Xerxes in his expedition against Greece. For in his enumeration of all those nations, he last of all inserts ours among the rest when he says, "At last there passed over a people wonderful to be beheld, for they spoke a Phoenician tongue with their mouths. They dwelt in the Salamine mountains near Broader Lake. Their heads were sooty. They had round razors on them. Their heads and faces were nasty horse heads. Also, they had been hardened in smoke. I think, therefore, that it's evident to everybody that Charles means us." So this individual is referencing what he saw and how he viewed the nation of the Hebrews. And Josephus, who is a Hebrew, says means us. Now, let's kind of reference this because it may sound derogatory, but when you read this writing in Josephus' part, he doesn't look at it that way, because he's trying to use another historical record to prove our people, that we are a nation, we're not from Egypt. And so he's using these different quotes. So let's focus on what, this is pretty elementary, but let's focus on it. He said their heads were sooty. Okay, talking about their head. Their heads and faces were like nasty horse heads that had been hardened in smoke. And so what do you think about when you think of soot, when this person describes what the reflection of these people? Soot is something blackish or brown, covered in soot, black powder, coal, wood, burnt, something burnt, blackish, brown, blackish. So this historical person that Josephus is quoting, because you got to understand, back then, folks didn't care about racial skin tone. That wasn't a big thing because no one cared at that time. But he's describing a nation. He's saying how they look. He said their heads were sooty. So it's very simple. He is describing people of color, and Josephus is quoting from Charalis. It's very simple. So far we see, based on some simple history, they're describing and telling you how the people in this region looked. But let's continue to go into our histories to show you that it wasn't Josephus, it wasn't Charalis that gave those examples, and also Herodotus as well. There were other historians such as Roman Tacitus, who was a Roman historian around the 1st century, who didn't really know a lot about the Hebrews. He was speculating like many people do today, yet and still, in his own understanding, he's trying to figure out who the Hebrews were. He may name some paganistic names and give up certain things that way, but he's still going to describe certain nations that he thought the Hebrews came from. And I want you to hear this and remember this. So Roman Tacitus, get the book, look it up. It's a quote from the book. The Jews are said to have been refugees from the island of Crete, who settled in the remote corners of Libya in the days when, according to the story of Saturn, was driven from his throne by aggression of Jupiter. This is a deduction from the name Judea, by which they became known. The word is to be regarded as barbarous, linking to Adiah, and the name of the people dwelling around the famous Mount Ada in Crete. So Yah rebuked that name Saturn and Jupiter. I had to read it, but Yah rebuked those pagan names in Yahushua Mashiach name. So far, this person is referencing where he thinks they came from. He said they're refugees and now they live in Libya. That was his understanding. Let's continue with his quote. A few authors hold that the region of Isis, the surplus population of Egypt, was evacuated to the neighboring lands under the leadership of Harasalama and Judas. Many assure us that the Jews are descended from those Ethiopians who were driven by fear and hatred to immigrate from their home country when Caiaphas was king. There are also some who say that the Mole collection of landless Assyrians occupied part of Egypt, then built their own inhabiting lands of the Hebrews in the nearer parts of Syria. And so this individual, Tacitus, is writing his own history and speculating 4 different regions he thought the Hebrews came from. But it's very interesting that he believed that the Hebrews were people from Egypt. It says Isis there. Yah rebuked that name Isis in Yahushua name because that's a pagan name, of course. But it says that the surplus population of Egypt was evacuated. So he's referencing and saying that the Hebrews were Egyptian. And it's clear we know how the people in that region look because the history has just told you that. Negroid people. So he said he thought they were Egyptian. He then says Jews are descended from Ethiopians. Now, why would this European Roman who had no thought of skin tone racism like modern day tones, why would he believe the group of Hebrews come from an Ethiopian race of people? Now, I just want you to think about that. We know the Ethiopians were people of color. It's very simple. He also thought we were Assyrian. And we also know, according to the history of those maps, the Assyrians were people of color. So these historical records are telling us the Hebrews were people of color, the people in the region were. And so the Father has made this very simple for us to see in history. You go into the works of Josephus again against Apion, book 2. Now we're going to show you how not just Tacitus, but in ancient time and even in the scriptures, the Hebrews were always confused with who? The Egyptians. In fact, one of the purposes of Josephus writing against Apion, like I said earlier, is he's trying to prove that they were not Egyptian. We were a Hebrew race of people. And that's why even in part 2, I'm doing the same thing in my video by proving that Israel was a seed of people from Noah. Everyone comes from Noah, and the Israelites are people of color from the seed of Noah. And that's what we try to prove in part 2 by going over that brief history. But let's read more of this now. Works of Josephus against Apion, book 2. Israel getting mixed up for being Egyptian. Let's read what he has to say. Now, though I cannot but think that I have already demonstrated and that abundantly more than was necessary, that our fathers were not originally Egyptians, nor were they thence expelled either on account of bodily diseases or any other commodities of that sort. Yet I will briefly take notice of what Apion adds upon that subject. For in his 3rd book, he relates that the affairs of Egypt, he speaks thus: I have heard of an ancient man of Egypt, that Moses was of Heliopolis, and he thought himself obligated to follow the customs of his forefathers and offered his prayers in open air towards the city walls, but that he reduced them all to be directed towards the sun rising, which was agreeable to the situation in Heliopolis. So once again, the Egyptians had this history where when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, and you can go into their ancient writings, they never talked about it. They didn't talk about what happened. They was trying to hide the history of what the Father, Yah, did to their false deities. And so to what? To stop that narrative from going out, they spread the rumor and started that the Egyptians, the Hebrews, were Egyptian. They were Egyptian, and they left Egypt. And that's why they said Moses was Egyptian. That was their narrative, right? Now, he was born in Egypt. We understand that. But they wanted that narrative to go out. And Josephus is coming against that narrative. Here's another quote from the works of Josephus. You can find his book if you don't want to buy it online, Early Jewish Writings.com, and you'll find his book at the bottom. It's real easy. You can buy it online. It's a simple book, historical. I'm going to quote another thing from the works of Josephus, how he's trying to let the people know we're not Egyptian. Let's read it. As for the Egyptians claim to be our kindred, they do it on one of the following accounts. I mean, either as they value themselves upon it and pretend to bear that relation to us, or else as they would draw us in to be partakers of their own infamy. But this fine fellow Apion seems to broad this reproachful appellation against us that we were originally Egyptians in order to bestow it on the Alexandrians, because also a lot of the Alexandrians at that time that lived in northern Egypt during this time in history, 1st century, there were Hebrews that lived in that region. So Apion, it's clear he wants to make these Hebrews originally Egyptian. And it's very clear in history what we hear and know about the original Egyptians of the scripture. Herodotus told you how they looked. The 2 other individuals, let's go back for a second to prove these things, told you the people that lived in that region and how they looked. And then you get to Tacitus, and he's also referring and saying these Hebrews either come from Egypt, Ethiopian, or Syrian. He's naming Negroid nations of people. So it's not a surprise that Josephus is saying we're not Egyptian. And all throughout the scriptures, that same notion was there as well in a few passages that we brought to show. Let's go to the first one. Exodus 2, 16 and 19. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their followers' flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. When they came to Reuel, their father, he said, how is it that you are come so soon today? And they said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and also drew water enough for us, and watered the flock. And he said to his followers, where is he? So these young women that got saved by Moses thought he was an Egyptian. Clearly, he had Egyptian clothes on. We understand that. But once again, there was a connection between people getting confused with the Negro Egyptians to the Hebrew, just like Tacitus was confused about it, okay? Because he thought that we either came from Egypt or Ethiopia. It's clear how these people looked 3,000 years ago in that region. And so if you know they looked that way in that region, what makes you think that they're going to look different today? Now, we understand there are different shades of people of color from, light brown to dark brown. I'm not here to discriminate no colors. I'm trying to show you, according to history, how these people look. We're not talking about modern day history. We understand who the Hebrews are today, and that's a different subject for a different time. But we do know in history, in the beginning, we know that the people that came out of Egypt were Negroid descent. Let's continue to show you how people got confused and thought the Hebrews were Egyptians. Genesis 50, 6 to 11. Let's continue. And Pharaoh said, go up and bury thy father according to as he made thee swear. And Joseph went up to bury his father. And with him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his house, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, and all the house of Joseph and his brethren, and his father's house. Only let their little ones and their flocks and their herds they left in the land of Goshen. And they went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. And they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond Jordan, and there they mourned with a great, very sore lamentation. He made a mourning for his father 7 days. And when the inhabitants of the land of the Canaanites saw the mourning of the floor of Atad, they said, this is a grievous mourning to the Egyptians. Wherefore the name of it was called Abel Mizraim, which is beyond Jordan. Now, we know that they could have saw them in a distance and saw some Egyptians. I understand a person can use that, but that's not really the point. The key point is, once again, the people that is viewing the nation of Hebrews, the Israelites, they still connecting them with the Egyptians. From Moses coming out of Egypt, from the Canaanites seeing the Hebrews with the Egyptians, mourning the loss of Jacob. There's a continuing connection from Josephus telling people a paean is lying about them being Egyptian, from Tacitus saying the Hebrews are from what? Egyptian, Assyrian, or Ethiopian in origin, from what Herodotus telling people how the Egyptians look. It's very simple how these people looked. Here's another example in scripture of how people got the Israelites confused with the Egyptians. And as Paul was to be led into a castle, he said to the chief, when Acts 21, 37 and 39, he said to the chief, may I speak unto thee? Who said, can thou speak Greek? Are not thou the Egyptian, which before these days made us an uproar and led it out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? But Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Caesarea, a citizen of no mean city. I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. So once again, we see, and there's more passages. You can go to Messiah going to Egypt, but that's not really connected to what we're talking about. He just went to Egypt, right? But there's other passages that talk about this, but I wanted to really reference these 3 especially because all throughout the antiquity of history, this happened. And that's why Tacitus also thought the same thing. And so when you look at the totality of all this information, and it's more information, but I want to touch on these few things. It's very simple what people thought about that region. And now I'm going to go back to this map for a second. Understand what we're trying to prove to you and show you, sons and daughters of Elohim who love the history of the scriptures. You're looking at these maps. You're looking at modern day maps, and you are assuming the people in that region are the same people. And that is not an accurate understanding of history, because there's not a region. It's only a few regions in the world right now that have that. But if you look at it, a lot of regions where Europeans took over, and Europeans definitely took over the Middle East, those regions look different now. And the people in those regions are totally different. Now we're focusing on the Hebrews, but we're showing these maps to show you 3,000 years ago when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, the Israelites were people of color. And people as it is this day, the seed of Israel this day is still a seed of people. We read it and looked into those things also in part 2. And so if Israel was a seed of people, and Yah said he'll never wipe out the race of people for good, because that's a promise he told Jeremiah, it's clear that this very Negroid race of people, they're still around today. All praises go to Yah through his son, Yahushua HaMashiach. Now we understand that through history, there has been some small portions of mixing, but we're not dealing with that subject because we're not afraid to talk about it. What we're showing you is it's a simple proof in ancient time. When you see this map of ancient Israel and you see this region, those people were people of Negroid descent that lived in the region. Josephus' writings prove it. Cornelius Tacitus told you. Herodotus told you what he saw. Gordon Higgins did his research and clearly showed you. British anthropologist Alfred Haddon said it. The Egyptians painted themselves all the time and other nations around them. Old maps tell you as well when you look at the map and compare it to now. And the scriptures connect the Hebrews with the Egyptians in regards to how they looked. There's a connection. You can't confuse this. Yah made this subject very simple, people. So once again, all praises go to Yah through his son, Yahushua Mashiach. I wanted to prove to you, based on a little history and based on a little information, how the ancient Israelites were people of color. And so I want to touch on this one last thing before we close this out. Give me 1 second. I'm going to open this up and I want to touch on this thing because one of the reasons why people have a tough time with this subject is because of these individuals and the spirit of these individuals. This scientific racism invented by Europeans, Joanne Blombach, Georges Buffin, and people before them. They created these theories of racial origin and they put the Caucasian race above everybody. They even say in their histories, Buffett and Joanne Blombach were believers in monogenism, the concept that all races have a single origin. They also believed in degeneration of theory of racial origins. They both said that Adam and Eve were Caucasian and the other races came about by degeneration from environmental factors such as sun and poor diet. So that's what they pushed on society. And that became like a known thought in philosophy and history in modern day cultures today. According to Bloomberg, there are 5 races, all belonging to a single species: Caucasian, Mongolian, Negroid, American, Mala race. Bloomberg states, I have allotted the first place to the Caucasian for reasons given below, which makes me esteem it the primeval one, meaning they're the number one. See, when we go over this information, people, when we go over this, we're not coming in this spirit. We understand what happened. Yah allowed the European to dominate the world. And that's fine. You can dominate the world. But the one thing you can't do, and one thing we won't allow you to do, is to dominate the world and attempt to change history and uplift yourself over everybody. When you come into this subject, we're coming from a Bible history standpoint. And if you have an issue with Bible history, you don't have an issue with me. You have an issue with your Father in heaven. The scriptures are clear. The history is clear. The people in these regions were totally different. If you want to find more information, you can easily have to buy books now because a lot of websites has blocked this. But Yah's made this subject very simple. So don't make a big deal out of it. It's not a big deal. It's not about uplifting. We all come from Adam. It's about dealing with the truth. And if you're dealing with the truth and you love your Father in heaven, then this is not a hard subject. The ancient Israelites were people of color. Proof that they are people of color. We showed you some proof. You make a choice whether or not you think it's true or not. If you say race doesn't matter, then go on Google search and type in biblical characters and tell the people that keep making them white that race doesn't matter. We're here to correct the liars in the spirit of Yahushua, in the spirit of truth. And if you got a problem with that, all praises go to Yah through his son, Yahushua Mashiach. He's not stopping us from talking about Bible history. So, once again, proof that they were people of color. We showed you the information. Pray the information is helpful. The writer spoke. The map spoke. The information spoke. Y'all get the praise, honor, and glory. In Yahushua Mashiach's name, shalom, shalom.